Okay. So, well, this is Chicago, Thomas. You may have not seen this. I thought this was, the polar lights last year. I think just one of the most beautiful pictures of the Midwest. This is our territory because we're in the Astana Midwest. So, I try to be sort of present this that is understandable really for folks not in medicine and not studying pharmacology, not in sort of also in psychiatry. But there are, I would say, a few technical terms. If you don't understand anything, just unmute yourself. You can interrupt me and ask questions. We're a small group, so my goal is that you understand kind of a little bit the background, and if there's an issue, please just speak up. So I want to start with giving you a little bit of an overview of nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is laughing gas. And this is a very simple molecule, N2O. So really one of the simplest, I would say, chemical molecules that we have in medicine. And it was discovered in around, I think, 1760, 1770 by Priestley when I think the early years of chemistry. So it was, again, a very simple molecule. My understanding is all the synthesis is also quite simple. And so you can see laughing gas parties. This was for 50, 60 years prior to the introduction of nitrous oxide in medicine. It was used as a party drug. It still is used as a party drug. And what important point, so this is sort of nitrous is, in here. And to this day, the party use of nitrous oxide is when you put this into balloons or some, gas-filled spheres, and then, people would inhale basically a 100% mixture, 100% pure nitrous oxide, so without any oxygen. And it's an interesting fact that maybe some of the lack of oxygen may also contribute to the effects of nitrous oxide on that is experienced. So people get high by inhaling 100% nitrous oxide. And there was even a movie by Charlie Chaplin on nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is just a few facts. It's a colorless, odorless gas. An interesting something, if you go on PubMed and look for nitrous oxide, even today, you will probably find that 9 out of 10 publications are from environmental sciences, because nitrous oxide is a product that is produced by soil bacteria. And it is a known greenhouse gas. And so I think right now, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, has been a lot of emphasis on understanding the production and release of nitrous oxide by soil bacteria during global warming into the atmosphere. It is assumed and measured that about 5 to 6% of all atmospheric nitrous oxide is due to medical, waste. The rest is really produced by soil bacteria. It is a very cheap drug, very safe drug. And the World Health Organization has listed on its list of essential drugs. It is very commonly used, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa and third world countries, because you actually don't need electricity. You don't need anything other than a nitrous and an oxygen tank to use it. So it's a very safe and a very easy to use drug. It's not a controlled substance, and as we discussed, it's a drug of abuse. So this is a nitrous oxide inhalation kit. And for those who abuse nitrous oxide, so nitrous is in whipped cream. The gas that drives whipped cream out of the canister is nitrous oxide. So it is, one of the most returned substance or, products in supermarkets because it's easily available to adolescents and teenagers. And then parents often wonder why there's no pressure in the whipped cream. So this is, as I said, a common drug of abuse. It's actually not very addictive, if at all, but it's highly abused. And I think it is fair to say that, especially in England, United Kingdom, it is, sometimes the abuse has reached endemic proportions. So where do we use it in medicine? As as I'm going to show you in a second, it's really a weak drug. So we can only use it as an adjunct for general anesthesia. It is very commonly used in dentistry. So dentists and dental assistants are allowed to use nitrous oxide by giving sort of a nasal mask without any monitoring, and without any sort of MD oversight over what we call sedation. It is also used in emergency rooms, mostly for children. For instance, if you have a small laceration, a small fracture, in order to quiet the kid, you can put on a 50-50% mix of nitrous oxide. It's also used during childbirth, to provide pain relief. And as I mentioned, it is very commonly used in third world countries. Now, a little bit about the pharmacology. So there's a few, I would say, aspects to this that you may not be familiar with. As I mentioned, nitrous oxide is N2O. It is not nitric oxide, which is NO. NO, I think in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, late 80s, Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded for the discovery of nitric oxide because it's the first gaseous transmitter in mammals and in humans. It is produced in very small quantities, and what it does, it relaxes blood vessels. And so it's currently used in a small sort of subset in medicine, but we need to distinguish nitrous from nitric oxide. In anesthesia, in pharmacology, we have a measurement that's called EC50. EC50 measures sort of the potency, how strong a drug is. In anesthesia for gases, we call it MAC, the minimal alveolar concentration, because we inhale a gas, and we measure sort of then the potency. You cannot anesthetize a human with just nitrous oxide. It is that weak. So the upper limit of what we're allowed to give is 70%. The balance needs to be oxygen, because otherwise you would be hypoxic and you may run out of oxygen. In order to anesthetize someone with purely nitrous oxide, you would have to go into a hyperbaric chamber and give more than 100% of nitrous oxide. So it's really a weak drug. One thing that stands out among the anesthetics is that it's actually has analgesic properties. So what this means is it's actually good for pain control. Most general anesthetics that we use, the drug class, has no properties. So the other ether-based anesthetics or propofol especially have no pain control. So you can give someone propofol and they would still be able to, in a low dose, still be able to feel pain. So that's an important distinction. So the one thing that is very cool about this drug is that it has a very fast onset. Once you give nitrous, it really equilibrates within 3 to 5 minutes in the human body and in the brain. And once you turn it off, as many of you may have experienced, it is gone within 5 minutes. So it is very fast onset, very fast offset. No metabolism means that there is, the drug basically leaves the body unchanged. We breathe it in and we breathe it out. But there's normally a drug is metabolized, is broken down in the liver or in the kidney or somewhere. For nitrous oxide, that's not the case. And it's also not stored in the tissue. So what are known side effects? Known side effects of nitrous, mostly in dentistry. There's an increased risk feeling nauseated, and also we sometimes see sort of even vomiting. Nitrous has an unusual side effect that it diffuses into gas-filled spaces and expands this. This has to do with the physical chemical properties of the gas. It replaces replaces nitrogen. And so if you in the human body have any gas-filled space, like a classic example would be a bowel obstruction, it can expand. In the worst case scenario, it could actually make the bowel explode. So that has been described. So we have to be careful avoiding nitrous oxide in these patients. It also has a very unusual side effect. I think it's only one of two known drugs that inactivates vitamin B12. I don't have time to go into this because I think it's quite interesting, also from a history of medicine perspective. If we have time at the end, I can sort of go a little bit into this, but it's sort of, that's unusual. It doesn't matter if you're exposed to nitrous oxide once, but if you get nitrous oxide repeatedly, then it does matter. And some patients, experience headache, a little bit of euphoria and vertigo, but once you turn nitrous off, these side effects are gone. Now, what is known, I'm going to just glance over this because this is for me also my own history in the field. And just for those of you interested, I want to touch upon a little bit about the knowledge, but it may be too technical for a few of you. So it started, at the Vienna General Hospital, AKH, where I did my training. And one of my friends, Michael Hüpfel, who was, sort of a co-resident with me and is here and joined us. So this is very cool. So, during my residency, I was invited to join a study, a clinical trial of xenon. So in German, xenon. And xenon is, it's a noble gas. So it should be completely chemical inert. It shouldn't do anything, right? But it does. And I actually think from a scientific perspective, that's an interesting question. How can a noble gas actually do anything in the human body? What my understanding is, like, induced dipole moments, but I actually have no clue if this is true. Xenon cannot be produced because it is, it needs to be through, I think, some physical chemical engineering, be condensed out of the atmosphere. And so it is very expensive. It's used in cars, I think in headlights. But it turns out xenon is as close to the ideal anesthetic as any other substance. It's not metabolized, it's not stored, because it was expensive, you have to use this machine. So what this machine is, and I don't have time to go into this too deep, this is a complete closed circuit anesthesia machine. So the only thing that's xenon, it flushes the system and the patient at the start of the case, but then it only circulates and you replace the oxygen of the patient, but otherwise everything stays the same. So a very cool system. Cost me a few sleepless nights because it was a completely new system, but I was exposed to a novel anesthetic that no one else has used before. So I think there may be only 50 to 100 people in the world who have ever anesthetized patient with xenon, but this was, for me, this was around 98, 99. And it turned out, and if you asked anyone, what's the mechanism of general anesthesia? How does it work in the brain? People would scratch their head. It was unknown. And so it just turned out this was the right time, that a lot of basic scientists looked into this also. And so Nick Franks is probably one of the most prominent, trained as a physicist at the Imperial College in London. He then worked together with a group at WashU on the mechanism of xenon. And it turns out that in all likelihood, xenon inactivates a specific receptor in the human brain that is a glutamate receptor subtype. Glutamate receptors are the main excitatory neurotransmitter, or the receptors in the human brain, and a specific subtype called the NMD receptor. This is important for the next piece of the story. And so it turns out that at Washington University in St. Louis, there was a group that actually looked into this, and not just the xenon, but nitrous oxide. And some of them have become very close friends of mine, and in the Department of Psychiatry and Anesthesia, and showed in '98, this was the first paper that really showed that also nitrous oxide is an NMD receptor antagonist in vitro. And so I went to WashU in the year 2000 as a research fellow. I got a Schrödinger stipendium from the FAF, and then I spent 2.5 years at WashU. And Mike Crowder, I joined his lab. He's an MD PhD scientist, anesthesiologist. who used C. elegans, the nematode C. elegans, to study the mechanism of anesthesia, which is just was very fascinating. So for 2 years, I worked a little bit on biochemistry on C. elegans. And since xenon, as I mentioned, is really, really expensive, we started with nitrous because both are gaseous, both have a similar presumed mechanism of action, and we wanted to test this in vivo. And so this was the outcome of one of the studies, where in a controlled genetic rescue experiment, where we, in an NMD receptor knockout strain, reintroduced genetically rescued the NMD receptor subunit, and could show basically in this that it restored the responsiveness to nitrous oxide. Again, don't have too much time to talk about this, but this was in a way the main finding of the study. So what do we know as of today about the mechanism of action of nitrous oxide in the brain? We know it's virtually exclusively postsynaptic. So if you have sort of the neurotransmitter from the presynaptic transmitter release and the postsynaptic receptor, the effects of nitrous oxide are only sort of at the after the neurotransmitter has been released. And this is a schematic of an ion channel. And here you can basically see, the different sort of binding sites of different. So this, for instance, is PCP. Ketamine is also an NMD receptor antagonist. It is an open channel blocker, and nitrous oxide presumably is sort of on the outside. So this just shows you what we think that both nitrous and ketamine, how they work to basically disrupt the mechanism of NMD receptor function. So this is all I'm going to say about the translational and basic science, because the main part of the talk is really on mood disorders, on depression. And I want to I'm not a psychiatrist. I've worked with them now for 10 years. So I think I understand some of the nuance, but by no means I am a psychiatrist. And, my respect for that field has only gone up. As you all probably know, the human brain is the most complex structure in the human body. And so understanding even the basics, the mechanism, what we call the pathophysiology, why, for certain diseases and conditions is really, really difficult. And that's why I think there's a lot of emphasis on trying to understand the mechanism of psychiatric disorders. So major depressive disorders affects at any given time at least 5% of the adult population, maybe more. The lifetime prevalence is about 17%. What this means is that every adult has a 1 in 5 chance of being diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And I'm going to tell you what are the characteristics, what are the criteria to be to meet. So what are basically the diagnostic criteria for someone to be diagnosed with major depression versus having sort of a depressive episode? Because we all have mood swings, and so there are times when we feel down, but this is not enough for someone to be diagnosed with a major depression. If a psychiatrist or a psychologist comes to the conclusion that a patient has major depressive disorder, then often they're prescribed standard treatment, and this would be drug treatment or psychotherapy. And the two drug treatments would be either, it's called SSRIs or SNRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So you get a pill a day, Prozac, for instance, but it takes about a month for it to become really effective. So there is, until the discovery of ketamine, really there was no rapid treatment to improve depression. Electroconvulsive therapy was, but it's also quite, I would say, drastic. But in terms of drug treatment, there was really no rapidly acting drug treatment. And this was only true until a few years ago, but there was really no new drug developed in the last 30 years. So this gives you an idea what elements there are, in patients with major depressive disorder. So it's really a brain network disorder that affects mood, low mood, low self-esteem, guilt, low interest in pleasure in things. Many patients have suicidal thinking, not all of them. And sort of the question about suicide is a separate one. Appetite, energy, either go up, energy going down, concentration, negative bias, and sleep. So it affects a multitude of domains of our behavior that are affected. So the psychiatrists will use this. This is the current table. It's called the DSM-5 criteria. It's a diagnostic standard manual in its 5th iteration, just came out a few years ago, in order for someone to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So you need to have at least 5 or more of 9 of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks in order for someone to be diagnosed with major depression. Persistent depressive disorder is if the depressive symptoms and the combination of these symptoms last for more than 1 year. And so one of the most severe forms, the form or the patient that we study, is called treatment-resistant depression. So what is treatment-resistant depression? It turns out that after a standard therapy, taking Prozac, that 1 in 3, 1 in 4 patients do not respond. They do not improve in their symptoms. 2 out of 3 improve. And so often then psychiatrists try a different drug, and often these patients fail. We have treated patients or studied patients who have failed up to 12 or 15 different drug treatments. So what is considered treatment-resistant depression are patients who have failed a minimum of 2, if not more, what's called adequate dose duration trials of antidepressant treatment. So in these patients are really sick and very difficult to treat. So for these patients, often ECT is electroshock therapy. Often that was the only hope for these patients to get better. And VNS is vagal nerve stimulator, which is quite basically you get a small electronic device implanted, and it stimulates a certain nerve, and it has shown actually quite promising results. But these patients are very sick and very difficult to treat. They're often disabled, and they can really not participate in everyday activities at all, and often lose their job, and the suicide risk in these patients is very high. So in terms of ketamine in depression, I just want to very briefly tell you this was considered one of the biggest breakthrough findings in depression research probably in the last half century, that ketamine, which is an anesthetic drug, has shown rapid improvement in depressed patients. And so just very briefly, because our focus is on nitrous oxide, by the way, the person who invented ketamine in 73, I think, unfortunately, he was a very famous chemist at the University of Michigan, and both of his daughters are anesthesiologists, and I know both of them quite well. He unfortunately died just 2 weeks ago at, I think, age 92. It was designed as a replacement for PCP, which is was a commonly used and abused drug. And so here's the structure for ketamine. I don't want to go too much into the detail. It's also an NMDA receptor antagonist, but it undergoes massive or extensive hepatic metabolism. What this means is the drug is broken down in the liver into a lot of different sort of subforms. And this is just to throw you off, to show you how ketamine is really broken down in the liver. This is really complicated. And so it turns out that some of these breakdown products in themselves have sort of properties, antidepressant properties, maybe pro-depressant properties, and also anesthetic properties. Very difficult to study drug and the metabolism. So what was the finding? This was a serendipitous finding in the early 1990s by a group in Yale in the Department of Psychiatry. So what they truly wanted to do was not to find a new treatment for depression. They heard about ketamine, and ketamine, if you give it by itself, it often produces hallucinations. So it's an uncomfortable drug. But the psychiatrists at Yale and neuropharmacologists, they thought, well, doesn't that sound a little bit like schizophrenia? The paranoia. So what they did is asked college students, these were their volunteers, asked college students if they could study them. And so they gave them an infusion of a small dose of ketamine over about an hour, and they wanted to study these kind of hallucinations and side effects. And so this was this paper, I think, probably has been cited now, I don't know, 2,000 times. And this is John Crystal is the current chair of psychiatry at Yale, who was, and they saw that, so this is not treatment-resistant depression. They saw that if you give a larger dose of ketamine, it increased anxiety, but in a smaller dose of ketamine actually decreased anxiety. And this was a serendipitous finding. We were like, whoa, this is not what we expected. And it turns out they followed up then in this study. So on the y-axis is a standard depression rating scale. So this is HDRS, the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. This is the way that psychiatrists would measure the severity and presence of depression. And to give you just a range, anything below 7 is not depressed. Anything above 21 is severely depressed. And so a reduction of 10 points is actually a huge effect. And so they infused patients with the same sort of a method of IV ketamine, and this is placebo, and this is sort of the ketamine response. And they found, this is sort of the breakthrough finding 20 years ago, that ketamine has, and we're talking, sorry that I cut this off, has rapid antidepressant effects. So within minutes after the infusion or hours, these patients feel better. So and often after a single infusion, this can last for a week or 2 weeks. So this is an interesting paradigm shift, that a single administration of a drug has effects improvement that may outlast any drug molecule that's left in the human body. So it's really was a huge paradigm shift in depression research. And this was then followed up by now looking at patients with treatment-resistant depression. So these are the patients that we study, and this was done at the NIH by Carlos Zarate, where they used the same approach, that infusion of ketamine, and showed that, again, this is now the absolute scale. The patients who received ketamine had a prolonged and sustained improvement in depressive symptoms above the placebo effect, which, to be candid, is virtually always seen in mood or depression research. So fast forward just about 2 years ago, the FDA approved Spravato, which is S-ketamine. That's sort of the S enantiomer of ketamine for the use in depression. It is now currently used. It's not an easy drug to give. It has a lot of side effects, but this has now is in clinical practice, and this is the way it looks. It's intranasal, needs to be given by MDs only, and is currently deployed in the United States. Well, this is just a summer picture in Chicago. So now let's talk about nitrous oxide in depression. So our hypothesis was understanding, our basic science sort of insights that nitrous may be an NMDA receptor antagonist. Ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. Ketamine has been shown to treat depression, then nitrous oxide should do the same. This was the hypothesis that we wanted to test. And so I partnered with the Department of Psychiatry back then at WashU, and this was sort of published in 2015. What we did, we picked very severely TRD patients, treatment-resistant depressed patients, in a crossover design. So both patients got both treatments, placebo and nitrous oxide. Now, what was the treatment? I'm going to show you how this works. An inhalation for 1 hour with 50% nitrous in a 50% oxygen mix, or basically an oxygen-enriched air. So, and there was no effect of it. For 1 hour, we titrated up the nitrous concentration at the beginning. We observed the patient with our standard anesthesia monitors, and then observed the patient for 2 hours after. This is just a schematic. This just shows you, this is very simple mechanical engineering. This is a nitrous tank, this is an oxygen tank, and this is basically a flow control where you basically how many liters per minute. You can also switch if you, again, the concentration, you can from 0 to 70, and that's sort of the maximum. And then you hook this up to the patient. Now, this is designed for dentists. This is called a nasal hood because, well, the dentists need to operate in the mouth. We don't. So what we use is sort of a face mask here. But there are a lot of different varieties. It's very comfortable for patients. And they can easily take it off if they feel discomfort. But the administration, the engineering there is really not complicated. This is really very much like a scuba apparatus. So what was our endpoint? Like in most depression studies, we used the change on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And I'm going to get to this in a second, what response and remission means. Now, the results were, going to skip this. This is the main result of the initial trial for 50% nitrous. That nitrous oxide had rapid antidepressant effect that started within 2 hours, and were most present on the next day. This is sort of when we stopped. This was a proof of concept trial. We just wanted to see if it works, and we did not plan to study the patients out for weeks. This is a complicated slide, but it's important for one reason, because when you ask patients, a typical interview for the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale has either 17 or 21 pre-designed questions, and they ask you in certain domains. And one would be depressed mood, guilt, suicidal ideation, and anxiety. And there are 17 more. It turns out we excluded patients who had active suicidal thinking, but it turns out that there was really a strong signal here that suicidal thinking, even in patients that were not supposed to have a lot, it was reduced. And this finding then helped us to land a $1 million grant from the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide, where we use something that I think no one has ever done before in the emergency department with patients with acute suicide thinking and intention to kill themselves. We are starting treating these patients with nitrous to help them for sort of, what the goal would be immediate relief. Currently, there is no treatment for these patients in the emergency department. So just to show you, psychiatry has defined response and remission. Response means a more than 50% improvement in depressive symptoms, and remission means actually that the patient has no depressive symptoms anymore. And 15% of patients with nitrous oxide after one inhalation met the criteria for remission, and 20% for response. So I'm going to skip this, but for the cognoscenti, so this is a heat map. One thing that was really interesting, when some patients returned a week after the inhalation, so this just shows you patients who got nitrous oxide as first treatment or placebo, and when they came back, it turns out, so blue is good, red means severely depressed. It turns out that after a week, some of these patients were basically completely okay. And we was like, whoa, this did not go as planned, because we thought that after a week, at most, patients would be back to their depressed normal. It turns out that's not the case. In some patients, the improvement lasted for a long time. And so this proof of principle study showed us that nitrous oxide works in very severely depressed patients. But then we had a lot of follow-up questions, and so we treated, this is just one case report. So this was open label study by, this was actually the son of a colleague who was severely depressed. This was 2 years ago from, here sort of in greater Chicagoland. And it turns out that we gave this was Christmas 2 years ago. We gave him 1 hour inhalation, and he was depression-free for more than 4 months. So we stopped recording this in February, but until then, he had immediate improvement within really hours and was depression-free for several months. So this is really, really crazy. That a single treatment can extend so long. Sorry. So fast forward, then we had a few important questions that we needed to answer. The 50% nitrous was relatively high concentration, and we didn't study formally how long the effects would last. And so this came out just in July this year in Science Translational Medicine. And so we had a follow-up study. Again, 20 patients with severe treatment-resistant depression. Now we had 3 arms: placebo, 25% nitrous oxide, 50% nitrous oxide, and we studied them for up to 2 weeks. And we learned a lesson. We split those treatments apart by at least 1 month. So I don't have to repeat this again. This was sort of the study design crossover. 1 patient would get all the 3 treatments, and these were sort of the main findings. Again, Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. It turns out there's sort of 2 important observations. One, that nitrous oxide, both 25% and 50%, improved the symptoms compared to placebo, fairly significantly, and that there was no difference between 25% and 50%. So this showed us that a lower concentration, half the concentration, had about the same positive antidepressant effects compared to the full, sort of the 50%. An interesting observation, so this just shows you the severity of depression prior to the study and at the end of the study. So after completing 3, a lot of patients had a very drastic improvement. And these patients here would no longer be considered as being depressed. But there's also one interesting sort of aspect to this. These 2, the most severely depressed patients, did not see any improvement. And so understanding why some respond and some don't is really, I think, for us, an important next step. I cannot give you an answer why some patients respond and why some don't. So going back to response and remission, it just shows that, in this signal, it actually would indicate that 50% nitrous oxide was a little bit stronger in a sort of a dose-response relationship. One thing that we did not expect, so this is a list of adverse events, very commonly presented in clinical trials. So this would be after 50%, this after 25%, and this after placebo, and this is cumulative. So 1 patient could report multiple minor adverse events, like dry mouth, nauseating, headaches. It turns out there were 47 AEs after 50% and only 11 after 25%. So this was completely unexpected, and it shows that the 25% concentration has a 4-fold reduction in adverse events. Interestingly, not surprisingly, also the placebo group saw a few adverse events. So I just gave you the conclusion. And to sort of finish out, just a few related projects that we're doing. So post-traumatic stress disorder is an important area. It is not depression. It is somewhat related, but it's not depression. And as you're probably aware, especially in US veterans, the #1 reason for premature death by suicide. PTSD has a very high incidence of suicide. So we partnered with Stanford University and the Palo Alto VA. And so here we basically did a proof of principle. And it turns out that, again, this is just a case study that, and this would be the standard measurement for post-traumatic stress disorder. So we saw that in 2 patients, PTSD drastically improved. 1 did not. And so we received a grant from the VA to study this in more detail in broader, but I think this is a glimmer of hope in a disease that is extremely hard to treat. And interestingly, antidepressants do not work in PTSD. So clearly showing that a mechanism is different. A few common misconceptions that I'd like to address. First, so this was in the first study, and it is sort of an article in the LA Times. The article actually was really well written, but the title was terrible because the normal response if you inhale 50% nitrous oxide or 25% is that you become sleepy. That's all there is. There's no euphoria, like overt, and no patients laughs. So the party experience that you inhale 100% nitrous, get a little bit sort of lack of oxygen is not the experience that we have in sort of in a clinical setting. So no patient laughs. I just want to make sure this is not triggered or mediated by laughing or laughter. Again, I mentioned from a scientific perspective, it is actually really interesting, right? Because there has been a fundamental concept in pharmacology that you need to have a drug bound, for instance, to a receptor, and then that institutes some conformational change to the receptor, and this is how a drug mediates its effect. But here we have a scenario that the drug is long gone, but the effects last for weeks, if not months. So this is really, I would say, from the neurobiology, a fascinating question. What's sort of the underlying mechanism? As if you would flip a switch, and then it stays like this. As I said, no patients did get high, and it's really not party use. So what are we sort of doing next in a way? Currently, we just yesterday had a results call where we go and actually we're trying to understand the mechanism. So partnering with WashU and neuroimaging laboratories, we've exposed volunteers and patients with depression to nitrous and did functional imaging before and after nitrous treatment. And I would presume that within the next few months we'll have some results never been done before. So I think this will be very exciting to understand the brain regions that are important for the production or where the antidepressant effects of nitrous oxide are mediated. We are starting patients with bipolar depression. So something that I have also learned in working with the psychiatrist, bipolar depression, bipolar disorder is, so what I mentioned, what my whole talk was about is major depressive disorder. It's also called unipolar depression. In these patients, the mood is either normal or depressed. In bipolar depression, you have phases where there's manic episodes. So the mood may be manic, and these patients often experience a crashing depression, and during these depression episodes have, among all mental health disorders, one of the highest risk of suicide. So it's actually really, really important. And some treatments work well for them, some do not. So this is something that I think is, for the prevention of suicide, a very important line of research. This is something that I mentioned before, sponsored by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, where we go into the emergency department. And then, once we have a better understanding, where and how to use nitrous, we ultimately really would try to obtain FDA approval to get this to the patients in a really regulatory approved setting. So these are some of the individuals who have helped. So the person in the center is Chuck Soromsky. He is the chair of psychiatry, one of the authors of the original nitrous oxide basic science papers in 98 and 99. And Chuck Conway, he's the director of the treatment-resistant depression clinic at WashU when I was at WashU before. So I want to thank all the sponsors. I want to thank Astina for allowing me to give this talk. I think it's exciting that we use Zoom to allow us to talk a little bit about our own research. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm obviously not the expert here, but it's really, really fascinating, the work that you do. I'll open it up for questions.
German is okay too.
So are other groups studying this too, or this is still your domain?
there are several groups studying this. So there's the leading, I would say, department of psychiatry in Australia. Monash University is studying this. Toronto, University of Toronto is studying it. So it's really, in a way, across the globe now. Mm.
Very interesting.
Questions?
So, Peter, why do you use the group of the treatment-resistant patients? Because quite a lot of the treatments that usually the depressive people use have lots of side effects and much more harming side effects than you show with nitrous oxide here.
The main reason is because there is for our psychiatrists will call this garden variety depression. There's actually effective treatments. You know, these patients are okay in getting Prozac for a month and then have improvement. So the psychiatrists don't think that it has really a role in standard normal depression. So you want to target the ones that are where there's really no treatment, and so that's why treatment resistant, and they're also much sicker.
Yeah, they are, but my focus is as an emergency doctor outside, that we handle quite a lot of people having these side effects from overdosing or misdosing of their antidepressant medication, and having every month some inhalation and then nothing in between could be quite risk minimizing.
Yes, that's definitely a sort of in a way a good idea. It will be for psychiatry to decide where they think they would like to use nitrous, and you know where it will find acceptance and where it may not, right? Because you know nitrous oxide has also some side effects, and we'll see, you know, whether you will accept it.
Ali, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. My question is, what would come next? We know that there are clinical trials ongoing. Do you envision FDA approval being sometime in the future?
So yes, well, you know, I'm part of, I would say, a group that explores sort of the commercial path, and so you know this is something we're actively trying to understand what will be needed to get FDA approval. Yes.
What would the timeline be for something like that?
So let me say one thing before I'm going to answer that question. So it is every physician in like virtually every country is allowed to give an approved drug in a different indication, right? It's the prerogative of a treating physician to you know to use drugs for unapproved indications. This is called, you know, off-label use or repurposing of drugs. So if you, for instance, think that aspirin will cure baldness, as a doctor, you can actually do this, right? And it's okay. You cannot market it in the United States, but you can give it. So we are actually, and this was the story with ketamine too. There were a lot of psychiatry departments, you know, who started the off-label, completely legal, but off-label use of ketamine to treat depression, treatment-resistant depression, to understand it better. Completely legal. It took, I would say, 7 years, I think, for ketamine, you know, for nitrous, because there's so much safety data safety sort of data out there. It is quite likely that there may be an accelerated and fast pathway for FDA approval because, you know, you probably will not need to do any sort of preclinical experiments. So, so it may just rely on one well-designed large clinical trial. So it could be 5 years, potentially shorter, potentially longer.
Just a note, Michael posted there, off-label use is what's been used for treating COVID-19, which is an interesting comment. As a non-medical person, the term was familiar, so thanks, Michael, for clarifying. Peter, I had a question too. Your study indicates that the 50 versus 25% was very similar in terms of effectiveness. Are there chances that maybe even much lower concentrations might be equally effective? The reason I'm asking is there a vision where you have the inhaler that you can bring with you and you don't have to bring cylinders as sort of like a treatment or even home treatment?
So excellent question. So we have with our commercialization partners, we also discussed this. It is an obvious question, right? That you say, okay, could a patient have home use? And the one interesting sort of aspect to this is that if you have a much lower concentration, it may no longer give anyone who wants to abuse the drug a high. And this could mean that it's really safe for home use. Right now, because it's unclear, and we do not want to basically get a drug of abuse into the just into the homes where it can be abused. We want to focus on a medical administration, right, in a clinical setting. But absolutely, it's absolutely possible. Yes.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question here. Greetings from the West Coast. In the beginning of your presentation, and thank you for your presentation, I think it was highly interesting. In the beginning, you mentioned that nitrous oxide is used for products like whipped cream. Just out of curiosity, are companies, manufacturers, for example, of whipped cream, are they aware of your findings? Do they consider using that for their marketing purposes?
For whipped cream, I don't know. That's okay. Interesting. I think they're actually really, in the US, I think they're really worried that there may be a risk of litigation, right? They will be sued. So I think they will stay away as far as they can from anything. But from a marketing perspective, it would be cool. I agree. But I think they fear that there may be a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit then against them, right? And they would so no, I've not heard, and they have not. But one of the strategic partners, that potential strategic partner that we have, is a medical gas company, one of the big companies that produce medical gases, and so I think that's that's the way to do it in our opinion, working with them.
Michael, on the whipped cream comment, is that the reason why eating whipped cream makes me happy? Is maybe there is more to it than sorry, Peter. Any other questions?
Would like to jump in from the Office of Science and Technology at the Austrian Embassy in Washington. Just wanted to know, hello, new in the team, wanted to know if you are also partnering with Austrian universities, faculties. Are there any links to our home country?
Yes and no. It is, we actually have a sort of a collaboration. We have not sort of done we have not enrolled a patient yet, but with Vienna, AKH we have, but it's not as so from a pure from a clinical trials perspective. It is, clinical trials are expensive and take a long time to plan, and so we now have to figure out what are the next projects that we want to do. But I would absolutely love to involve Austrian places. Absolutely. Neunkirchen, Michi.
Ja, ich werde ein Drill Sergeant, um die Leute reinzuholen.
Michi is now in Neunkirchen. He's the chief of anesthesia in Neunkirchen.
we're almost at the top of the hour. Maybe Peter, one more question. With this unique treatment, maybe unlike some others where medical companies might stand to make a lot of money when they develop it, your ingredients are very cheap. So who would finance these big studies when maybe there isn't as much money to be made, right? Because anybody can use their own gas supplier to do this at the end.
Yeah, so also a good question. If you get an approved, right now nitrous oxide is, I think, as a medical gas, it is not prescribed as and reimbursed as a drug. In this case, there may be actually reimbursement as a real drug, and you have to understand that that none of the psychiatrists, no one there has ever used a medical gas, so it would be a completely new market for them. So I think, and ultimately, this was sort of the commercial aspect. Personally, for me, it doesn't matter. It's actually great that it's cheap because then folks in sub-Saharan Africa can use it, and they can actually treat patients who need it, where otherwise it would be very difficult or expensive, right? So personally, I don't really care about the commercial side. So I think if it shows promise, then we need to do everything. And there is in the US there's really money, there are funds for investigator-initiated clinical trials, right? Partnering with the NIH and partnering, so to co-develop this, to really get an FDA approval.
Thank you. Any last question? Anybody wants to ask Peter? If that's not the case, thank you very much again, Peter. Really, really interesting talk, and look forward to future Astana virtual talks as well. Thank you very much, and have a good weekend.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye. Out from